เทสโอเคเสียงมาทีนี้เราไปดูเทรลเลอร์กันก่อนแล้วกันถือว่าเวลาตัดเราก็จะได้สามารถตัดเอาฉากอื่นออกไปได้นะเราก็เก็บไปแค่นี้พอไปเชิญย้อนเวลากลับไปสักหน่อยกดเปิดเต็มจอโอเคทำไมกูไม่ไปเปิดเต็มจอตรงจอนู้นวะแหมใครจะมาเห็นเรื่องกับกูไอ้หมอนี่แต่เช้าเลยนะพี่ใช่เฮ้ยเซกิโร่จบแล้วนะ3 ตอนเท่านั้นโอ้โหแบบอีซี่เมื่อไหร่เราก็ตื่นเช้าเหมือนกันนะเนี่ยเผลอๆพี่ว่าเซกิโร่เราไม่ต้องตัดด้วยซ้ำอ่ะอันนี้พี่จะมาเปิดไว้อันนี้เผื่อว่าถ้าเราจะตัดอะไรเงี้ยก็คือพี่จะเปิดเป็นเทรลเลอร์ไว้ให้ดูเงียบๆทีเนี้ยเราก็ค่อยตัดเข้าไปที่เกมเป็นที่เกมปั๊บก็คือพี่วางแผนไว้เราก็แค่ตัดย่อมันออกไปตัดตัดช่วงระหว่างนั้นออกประมาณนี้พี่เสียงแหบอ่ะก็ไม่ถึงอาทิตย์นี้ใช่แต่กิโลเนี่ย3 วันอ่าอะไรนะอาทิตย์จันทร์อังคารจบแล้ว easy เพราะเคยเล่นมาแล้วไงพี่บอกเลยเล่นแต่เซกิโ คือเกมที่ง่ายที่สุดในบรรดาเกมจาก From Software โอเคเดี๋ยวพี่พาไปดูเทรลเลอร์ก่อนพี่นี่มันเป็นเกมฟรีอ่ะขอเวลานอกต้องเปิดเสียงดังไหมเปิดเสียงดังไปเถอะ
I've begun my voyage in a paper boat without a bottom. I will fly to the moon in it. I've been folded along a crease in time, a weakness in the sheet of life. Now you've settled on the opposite side of the paper to me. I can see your traces in the ink that soaks through the fiber, the pulped vegetation. When we become waterlogged and the cage disintegrates, we will intermingle.When this paper aeroplane leaves the cliff edge and carves parallel vapor trails in the dark, we will come together.
โอเค เกมนี้เป็นเกมอ่าขอต้อนรับทุกท่านนะสู่ Dear Esther Landmark Edition นะ คือต้องบอกไปก่อนว่าเกมนี้เป็นเกมที่เขาแจกฟรีมา แล้วผมก็รู้สึกว่า เกมมันดูน่าสนใจแปลกๆ อันหนึ่งขอเปิดสตรีมแป๊บ จากที่เขาเขียนไว้ว่าแท็กยอดนิยมจากผู้ใช้สำหรับผลิตภัณฑ์นี้ก็คือเกมนี้มันเป็นเกมแนวอะไรก็แปลกกูสำลักน้ำลายตัวเองแป๊บหนึ่งโอเคเอาใหม่โอเคสำหรับเกมนี้นะเกมนี้ก็จะเป็นแนวจำลองสถานการณ์การเดินถ้าไม่ถึงเป็นจำลองวะอินดี้ดูจากภาพก็คิดว่าอินดี้แล้วล่ะมีบรรยากาศอะไรอ่ะแคชชวลง่ายๆแคชชวลเหมือนจะเป็นเกมแนวแบบว่าง่ายๆนะเอ่อผมไม่รู้ผมไม่ชัวร์ว่าใช่หรือเปล่าผมไม่เคยมานั่งแคร์ว่ามันเป็นเกมแนวอะไร เพราะปกติจะบอกว่าเอ้ยแม่งเป็นโซลไลท์เกมมันยาก อยากจะลองเล่น อยากจะแบบชนะให้ได้ เราจะได้รู้ว่ามันแบบสุดยอดแค่ไหนนะ นี่เลยนะ ใครที่ต้องการจะรู้ว่าสตรีมผมชื่ออะไรนะ สตรีมผมเนี่ยชื่อคามิยะโซสกิฮะแปะช่อง YouTube ของกูไปด้วยในตันกอนนี่เป็นชื่อเก่า เราละทิ้งมันไม่ได้นะฮะก็คือในตันกอสอะโลโก้มันจะเป็นตัวข้างล่างนี้ แต่จะไม่มีขีดตรงกลาง เรา ไอ้พวกเนี้ยคือมาเติมทีหลังจนมันดูแบบเละแต่ว่าผมก็คิดว่ามันเป็นความเละที่เพอร์เฟกต์ผมพอใจกับอ่าภาพปัจจุบันมากนะถ้าใครมาว่าอะไรกูนี่คือกูไม่ฟังอะนะโอเคไม่ฟังแล้วนะว่าแบบคุณไม่พอใจอะไรกับรูปผมว่าเอ้ยมี่มันน่าจะแบบดีกว่านี้ไม่พอใจก็ทำรูปส่งมาให้กูด้วยนะเออเจ้าของก็พอใจคุณมาไม่พอใจได้ยังไงวะ โอเคงั้นก็เดี๋ยวไปลองดูจากแนวเกมนะฮะไปลองอ่านดีเทลเกมสักหน่อยดีกว่า Dear Esther immerse you in stunningly realize world a remote and desolate island somewhere in the outer Hebrides as you step forward a voice begins to read fragment of a letter Dear Esther and so begin journey through one of the most original first-person game of recent year recent year แปลว่าในปีนี้นะปีนี้เหรอใช่ปะผมว่า recent year มันคือปีนี้แต่ว่าDear Esther เนี่ยมันเป็นเกมที่จะทำให้คุณตกอยู่ในอะไรอะอยู่ในภวังค์ความมึนงงของโลกใบนี้การควบคุมแล้วก็ถูกถูกการและเกาะที่ถูกแยกนะสถานสักที่ใน Outer Hebrides ผมว่าอันเนี้ยน่าจะทับศัพท์ได้เพราะว่าเหมือนเขาจะเรียกรวมๆไปดังที่คุณได้เดินไปข้างหน้าเสียงแห่งการเริ่มต้นที่จะตามหาชิ้นส่วนของจดหมายนะก็คือไปตามหาจดหมายนั่นแหละ Dear Esther และเริ่มต้นการผจญภัยผ่านเกมที่เป็นรูปแบบ First Person แบบดั้งเดิมนะฮะที่มีความเป็นรูปแบบดั้งเดิมมากที่สุดนะก็กด Option นะฮะทีนี้เราก็กดไปที่วิดีโอนะและให้แล้วเหรอไหนดูดิไหนดูโลดิโลก็ดูไม่มีอะไรแตกต่างเอ๊ะเดี๋ยวต้องลองก่อนมันไม่เห็นอ่ะไม่เห็นความแตกต่างเท่าไหร่ไม่เป็นไรออกแค่นี้ไปก่อนนะลองดู Dear Esther Landmark Edition ก็ได้กล่าวถึงดีเทลไปเรียบร้อยแล้วเดี๋ยวค่อยไปลองหาแปลซ้ำดูอีกทีแต่คิดว่ามันน่าจะแปลตามที่ผมแปะไว้หรือแปลเลยดีแล้วเปิด Google มาพิสูจน์ถึงความแข็งแกร่งในภาษาอังกฤษของข้ากันเอาเลยอย่าได้รอช้า Dear Esther พาคุณเข้าสู่โลกแห่งความจริงนานี้ Immerse แปลว่าพาเหรอเนี่ยแช่จมจุ่ม What อ๋อเขาเป็นว่าเอาเป็นเหมือนแบบไอในอารมณ์ว่าเข้าถึงนั่นแหละจุ่มลงจุ่มลงซึ่งถ้าเราจุ่มไปในความมึนงงซันนิงลี่คือความน่าทึ่งนี่เองใช่เหรอวะ extreme impressive or attractive manner ทำให้งงงวยทำให้งงงวยทำให้คุณทึ่งใน realize ตระหนัก ตระหนักถึงความมึนงงทำให้ทึ่งช่างหัวมันเถอะเอาเป็นว่ามันพาเข้าสู่โลกแห่งความเป็นจริงที่น่าทึ่งนะแล้วเกาะที่ห่างไกลและรกร้างเหรอรีโมทไอแลนด์รีโมทมันถ้าเรามองอีกทีนึงมันแบบเหมือนถ้าเรามองอย่างรีโมททีวีแม่งก็เป็นอะไรนะการควบคุมระยะไกลรีโมทนะมันเป็นการควบคุมระยะไกลดังนั้นถ้าเกิดว่าเป็นรีโมทไอแลนด์เนี่ยรีโมทไอแลนด์ก็คือเกาะที่ห่างไกลส่วน desolate แปลว่ารกร้างภาษาอังกฤษมันก็จะของแข็งแกร่งมากถูกต้องแม่งไม่ตรงเลย is somewhere in the outer Hebrides นะฮะและรกร้างแห่งหนึ่งใน Hebrides ชั้นนอกฮะอ่านว่า Hebrides เหรอเนี่ยโอเคแปลว่าเอาเป็นว่า outer แปลว่าชั้นนอกนะโอเคควบคุมระยะไกลรกร้างอ่ที่น่าทึ่งเข้าสู่จมลงดิ่งช่างแม่งและเมื่อคุณก้าวไปข้างหน้านะฮะ as you step forward แล้วเมื่อคุณก้าวไปข้างหน้าเสียงหนึ่งจะเริ่มอ่านเศษจดหมาย a voice begin to read fragment อ่ะถามจริงจะมีเสียงอ่านจดหมายแล้วเนี่ยเรียนเอสเธอร์และเริ่มการเดินทางผ่านเกมในมุมมองบุคคลที่หนึ่งที่แปลกไปที่สุดในช่วงเวลาไม่กี่ปีที่ผ่านมาอ้าวแม่งเลยอังกฤษกูแม่งไม่แข็งแกร่งเลยนี่หว่าเริ่มการเดินทางผ่านในเกมมุมมองคนที่หนึ่งand so begin journey through one ผ่านเกมในมุมมองที่หนึ่ง one of most original ไม่เห็นมีอะไรที่เขียนว่าแปลกใหม่เลยไม่ใช่เหรอวะหรือว่าออริจินอลออริจินอลคือออริจินอลมันคือความหมายในเชิงดั้งเดิมหรือว่าแบบมันไม่มีอย่างอื่นที่แบบเหมือนอารมณ์เหมือนมันเป็นต้นฉบับอะดั้งเดิมแรกเริ่มก็คือมันเป็นเกมแบบมันเป็นเกมแรกที่ทำมาแนวนี้เขาก็เลยบอกว่าเขาก็เลยมาแปลว่ามันเป็นเกมที่แปลกใหม่ที่สุดคือมันไม่ได้แปลกแต่ว่ามันคือเกมที่ออกแบบมาใหม่มันก็เลยดูแปลกอ้าวแม่งย้อนกลับมาแปลกแล้ว ช่างแม่งเอาเป็นว่า Google ช่วยทันได้ แต่ว่าอย่าไปพึ่งพา Google มาก เดี๋ยวระบบการแปลเราจะเป็นตาม Google เอากด Start ไปเลย ทีนี้เราจะไปเริ่มที่ไหนเหรอ ให้กูเลือกได้แค่ที่เดียวDirector Commentary คืออะไรวะ เลือกไปก่อนที่บังเกอร์ เสียงมันจุดจบของโลกเลย แล้วเอ่อเมื่อไหร่จะเข้าคัสซีนอะอ้าวไม่ต้องเหรอ ไหน
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of The Chinese Room, and
Ciao.
this is the Dear Esther Developers Commentary.
Hi, I'm Rob Briscoe, I'm the artist on Dear Esther.
And I'm Jessica Curry, and
What?
I was the composer on the game.
So what you're looking at today is a remake of a mod. Dear Esther started off in 2007 as a Half-Life 2 mod that did really, really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of Rob, who worked as the primary developer on a Source remake of the game that was released in 2012. And this year is another remake where it's been updated for a cross-platform release, and we wanted to add in this developer's commentary just to give you a bit more of an insight into some of the ideas behind the game as it came together.
แม่งพูดไม่เกรงใจกูเลยซับไตเติ้ลอยู่ไหนวะ language ภาษาอังกฤษดีแล้ว controller ซับไตเติ้ลมึงจะบอกให้กูมาแปลนี้เองนะเฮ้ยไม่ไหวนะกูใจแตกได้เลยแล้วเนี่ยงั้นเดี๋ยวเอาเสียงธรรมชาติออกไม่ได้
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther developers commentary.
Hi, I'm Robert Briscoe. I'm the artist on Dear Esther.
And I'm Jessica Curry, and I was the composer on the game.
เหมือนจะ
So
เป็
what
น
you're looking at today is a remake of a mod. Dear Esther started off in 2007 as a Half-Life 2 mod that did really, really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of Rob, who worked as the primary developer on a Source remake of the game that was released in 2012. And this year is another remake where it's been updated for a cross-platform release, and we wanted to add in this developer's commentary just to give you a bit more of an insight into some of the ideas behind the game as it came together.
โดยรวมนะฮะมันจะเป็นเหมือนกับการที่เขาบอกเขาพูดเกี่ยวกับว่าเกมเนี้ยมันให้ถูกวางจำหน่ายในปี
Hello
2017
everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room,
โอ้ย
and this is the
พอ
Dear
แล้ว
Esther
ไม่ฟังแล้วโว้
developers
ย
commentary.
Hi, I'm Robert Briscoe. I'm
Yep,
the
go on.
artist on Dear Esther.
โดกู
And I'm Jessica Curry, and I was the composer on the game.
So what you're looking at today is a remake of a mod. Dear Esther started off in 2007 as a Half-Life 2 mod that did really, really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of Rob, who worked as the primary developer on a Source remake of the game that was released in 2012. And this year is another remake where it's been updated for a cross-platform release, and we wanted to add in this developer's commentary just to give you a bit more of an insight into some of the ideas behind the game as it came together.
ก็เดี๋ยวพูดใหม่แล้วกันก็คือเกมเนี้ยถ้าสรุปโดยรวมแล้วบทพูดที่เขาพูดอยู่ตรงสะพานนั้นน่ะก็คือบทพูดที่บอกว่าเกมเนี้ยเป็นเกมที่ถูกวางจำหน่ายในปี 2017 แล้วก็มีการทำคอร์สแพลตฟอร์มอะไรเรียบร้อยแล้วแล้วทีเนี้ยอีกอย่างหนึ่งก็คือเกมนี้ที่ถูกพัฒนามาตั้งแต่ปี 2012 นะโดยมีสมาชิกคนที่มาพูดมีทั้งหมด 3 คนนะฮะที่ช่วยกันทำเกมนี้ขึ้นมานะแล้วเราก็จะมาดูข้อความตัวนี้
So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
เหมือนเขาบอกว่าในเกมเนี้ยเราอะไรอะสิ่งที่เราจะต้องทำในเกมเนี้ยก็คือการที่เราต้องไปหาเบาะแส
So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything.
มึงพูดให้จบ
One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
ก็โดยรวมเขาแค่บอกว่าทุกสิ่งทุกอย่างรอบตัวเนี่ยเหมือนจะบอกว่ามันสามารถเอาไปเป็นเบาะแสหรืออะไรได้นะ
So you'll see around you
โอ้โหไป
in a lot of the environments, there's
ไม่จะพูดอะไรนักหนา
a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound, all of these little bits and pieces are kind of layered in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
คือมันมีเบาะแสอยู่เยอะแยะมากมายซะจนแบบไม่น่าเชื่อเป็นว่าเป็นประมาณนั้นแล้วกันเพื่อให้เราอินกับเกมรอยเลือดเหรอเป็นแค่เศษใบไม้กันต้องลองเดินไปตามทางดูก่อนว่าจะมีรอยแบบนี้อีกไหมถ้าหากว่าไม่มีแสดงว่ามันไม่มีว่ะรอยเลือดเหรอมันจะมีมาเบาะแสต่างๆนานามากมายนะแล้วก็แถมยังมีอัลตราซาวด์ด้วยมีถ้ำด้วยเว้ยนี่ก็คือถังสีรอยเลือดเดินต่อมาทางนี้ซึ่งคาดว่ารอยเลือดน่าจะตกลงไปข้างล่างแต่นี่จะใช่รอยเลือดจริงหรือไม่เราก็ไม่รู้ได้ดูเหมือนว่าจะไปต่อไม่ได้อาจจะมีใครมาทำรอยเลือดหลอกไว้ตัวจริงอาจจะเข้าไปข้างในถ้ำแล้วเพราะงั้นเข้าไปในถ้ำแล้วช่วยเปิดไฟฉายให้กูหน่อยมืดจังเว้ยโอเคเมื่อมาถึงที่นี่ก็จะพบว่ากูไปต่อไม่ได้กูมาทำไมเนี่ยเดี๋ยวทำไมกูเดินตัวเอียงอย่างเงี้ยอ๋อนิ้วชี้กดตัวดีไว้อยู่ sorry ทีนี้เป็นไปได้ว่าอาจจะไม่ใช่แบบที่ผมคิดรอยเลือดอาจจะไม่ได้เดินจากทางนี้ไปที่นู่นมันอาจจะเดินจากที่นู่นมาทางนี้ต่างหากล่ะนี่ไงยังมีรอยอยู่ไม่ชัวร์ว่าจะใช่รอยเลือดหรือเปล่าแต่รอยมันเดินมาทางนี้ถ้าหากว่าเป็นรอยเลือดจริงอะนะถ้าดูแล้วมันก็แอบเหมือนซองขนมสีแดงเฉยๆน่าจะเป็นเศษขยะมากกว่าแต่มันก็มีไล่มาเรื่อยๆและรอยนี้ก็ให้เดินทางเข้ามาให้เดินทางไปที่นี่อ่ะ
I'm Dan Pinchbeck. I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther developers commentary.
Hi, I'm Robert Briscoe. I'm
โอเค
the
สรุปแล้ว
artist
ไม่
on
ใช่
Dear
รอยเลือด
Esther.
นะฮะกูเดินหาอะไรอยู่เนี่ย
And I'm Jessica Curry, and I was the composer on the game.
So what you're looking at today is a remake of a mod. Dear Esther started off in 2007 as a Half-Life 2 mod that did really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of Rob, who worked as the primary developer on a Source remake of the game that was released in 2012. And this year is another remake where it's been updated for a cross-play.
ว่าไง
Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight-through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each place you were. And I was really interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can interpret. So I loved the idea that you could have two people that had played this game and then would have a conversation about it. And one of them would say, oh, what did you think about when this happened? And the other person would be like, well, that didn't happen for me. I had a completely different event happen or a completely different story happen. And it kind of feels very gamey in that way that actually one of the things I love about writing for games is that you hand over so much control to the player that it becomes their story, and that's really important rather than trying to force them. So using randomized blocks of voiceover in the game and the kind of randomized prop details that Rob was talking about means that it gives it a really different feeling every time you go through. And that's kind of interesting for me, because I like the idea of going, well, not everyone has to have the same experience, and because it's interactive, you have the capacity to have very different experiences occupying the same space. So yeah, but balancing all that then becomes an absolute nightmare.
I think it's nice though, because everybody gets a personal experience. Like, I love reading the forums and seeing how people come and they sort of tell their story and what they interpreted of it, and then you see other people discussing what they thought of it. And to me, it's kind of nice because everybody takes something unique away from it.
ฟังไม่รู้เรื่อง
When I wrote the music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was absolutely no budget whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled. But one of the good things about that is it actually forced me to be quite creative about how I wrote the music. So with my background in sound art, I wanted to use samples in a different way that wasn't just using it to sound like a violin. I wanted to time stretch and manipulate samples to make something different and strange and quite unique. But then when we got the Indie Fund money, I had the amazing opportunity to re-record the music with live players. And that was so exciting for me, actually, because that's where it comes to life. And I thought long and hard about whether to write new music, going from the mod to the commercial version, but actually I decided that my initial and original emotional response to the game was probably going to be the strongest response and reaction that I had. So I just literally, the music that I'd written for samples, I then wrote out for live instruments. But what they bring to it is transformative, actually. And I think The Beach is a really good example of this, where, you know, you have these awful samples soaring away, and then you have the string quartet playing this very bleak, very sparse music, and they bring the presence of the island immediately to it, and it comes to life. And that's the exciting thing about it. It wasn't a huge budget, but just having that experience of working with the players was just magical.
สรุปโดยรวมมันก็คือการที่เขาบอกว่าเขาประทับใจกับเพลงในเกมนี้มากเลยเหมือนว่าเกมเพลงในเกมนี้เนี่ยจะทำให้เกมนี้มันยกระดับขึ้นนะอะไรประมาณนั้นคือฟังไม่รู้เรื่องกูจับใจความได้แค่เนี้ยว่ามาอ้าว
Everything about Esther for me is a dream. The landscape is not an island, it's the dream of an island. The music is like music that you wake up because you've heard in your sleep, but you're not conscious of hearing it. And the language in the story was supposed to be like that as well. It didn't matter the sense it made, it was more about the kind of the shapes it created, if that makes sense. So that the words would kind of were like being in water, like listening to something underwater. It'd be this very dreamlike, symbolic, poetic thing, and it always had frustrated me in games with game writing. This has really changed quite a lot. There was never any space for poetic language. It was very exposition-y, very descriptive, very direct. And you'd have like art and audio would have these amazing creative spaces they could explore. But when it came down to actually writing, you just had to basically go into the room, describe the character, tell the player what to do. And it just seemed like the most boring thing you could do with words in a game. And why couldn't a writer have the same artistic freedom as a visual artist or an audio designer or a musician, in terms of being able to say, isn't this just about creating this kind of emotional tone, this emotional space? And it's really, I still love that about the game. And it's one of the things I love so much about Nigel's voiceover, is it has this really odd, disconnected, kind of dreamlike quality to it, where you might finish the game and not actually understand anything that happened, but you're being carried along in the flow of it. And without any kind of sarcasm at all, I get into trouble saying things like this. The same design principle applies as this to Halo. It's 30 seconds of fun, or 30 seconds of depressing engagement, I guess, in our case. But it is about that loop of being in the moment in the game constantly, and that's actually the critical thing that matters.
เหมือนผมจับใจความไม่ค่อยได้เท่าไหร่จับได้แค่ช่วงแรกๆว่าเหมือนเสียงเพลงที่ดังขึ้นเมื่อตะกี้ตอนที่เราเดินไปอยู่ตรงนู้นนะเป็นเพลงที่เขาออกแบบมาเพื่อทำให้เราตื่นนะคือแบบเห็นไหมตอนเนี้ยเราตอนแรกๆอยู่อย่างเงี้ยมันจะมีเสียงทะเลมันจะทำให้ชวนให้เรารู้สึกแบบสงบง่วงๆแปลกๆเว้ยเพราะงั้นพอเราไปถึงตรงนู้นแล้วมันจะมีดนตรีดังขึ้นมาแล้วมันก็จะทะยานอะไรถึงมันต่อไม่รู้ช่างมันฟังนี้ต่อ
So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about this is one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape. We had three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these practical constraints. We don't want to set it on a spaceship, we don't want to set it in an Eastern European city, so it's got to be on this kind of like this desolate landscape. And we want to limit the player, so an island seems like a natural choice. And it's really interesting how you start from that, and we had this big lump of clay on a table that we were carving out paths and things to annoying the cleaners and things like that. And Jess and I were talking, and Jess started making sort of snippets of music to kind of go in there. And then all of a sudden we just went, oh, that's the story. Oh, that's what happened here. But it really started, I think, from the place. And when we started looking at photographs of Bore, we started going and reading some of the history behind it. Suddenly that was it. And it just was really, really naturally became, this is the place, this is what happened here, this is how it feels. And then everything else kind of coalesced around that.
Yeah, I think as an artist it made my job a lot easier because those islands are so kind of like the environment is kind of hostile. You're out there in the Hebrides. You've got this kind of like inclement weather. You've got cold, rain, snow. It's a very kind of it can be a very depressing place to be at times, but it's also at the same time very beautiful, and it's this kind of like stark, bare landscape, but that has this beautiful surroundings. So it's in terms of art, I think it really helped me to portray a lot of the themes in Dear Esther.
And there was a natural fit with the music as well. It suggested a musical style, which was really key, I think.
โอเคก็เหมือนโดยรวมเขาแค่อยากจะบอกว่าเกมเนี้ยจะมีสภาพอากาศนะที่แบบแตกต่างกันไปไม่ว่าจะเป็นฝนร้อนแรงหรือหิมะหรืออะไรพวกนี้นะก็อยากโปรโมทแค่นั้นเอ๊ะทำไมมีอันนี้ด้วยวะปกติมันมีเบาะแสอะไรแบบนี้ด้วยฟังนี้ต่อ
One of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before, based on a Christina Rossetti poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral music and I thought, hang on, this is absolutely perfect for Esther. But I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get in the game is the first line of the choral piece of music. But that actually went on to form the main theme of the music that I wrote. And I think for me it's really interesting about how things that you've written earlier, years before, sometimes come in really, really useful and fit. So I always tell people and students not to despair if something doesn't get used or doesn't work at the time, because actually there'll come a place or in a time where you think, hang on a minute, I've got something that fits. So in terms of that memorable theme, the Remember theme gets used in multitude of different ways during the game. And one of the things it does is helps you to identify the kind of psychic place that you're in the game. So the theme is played in lots of different ways, and actually you'll notice that as you go through the game, it becomes more and more broken and more manipulated and broken down as the player goes through the journey and as you're psychologically struggling to get to the end point in the game. So music's really, really useful for highlighting the psychological mood and we talk a lot about psychogeography, which always sounds a bit pretentious, but actually I think it's really important to what the three of us did in the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan, maybe you want to talk
like
a bit
the
about
core
that.
kind of idea about psychogeography. If you're not in the place you're in, is not the place you're in, or you create the place you're in. It's not just as you're here and then the landscape's out there, but you don't navigate like a city by street signs and by those kind of formal things. You navigate it by the things which are significant to you in the way that you've lived in that space. And I think that was really kind of key to, I think it's really central to how the fusion of art and story and music come together in Dear Esther, because it's not a place where we're going, right, we have to lead the player up here because it's a natural formation, and then you would naturally have a piece of music here because you come around a corner. But the story, music and art all work around the idea of what's going on in the narrator's head at this point. How do we represent his emotional state relative to this landscape? And again, it's that idea of the game is, it's a dream of a place. It's like the idea of it being a fever dream or a coma dream, which obviously ties in a lot with the kind of story, and we'll come back to in a lot more detail when we get to the caves a bit later on.
ไอ้ผู้หญิงแม่งยังขิงเพลงตัวเองไม่เลิกเลย
White Lines.
Yeah.
They actually did this. It was really cool. I found this historical document. They used to do this on Bora and the Hebrides. If their disease broke out,
Really?
they'd actually chip out and expose the chalk. So if you're on a boat and you were coming to the island, you know not to land because it was infectious, which is the coolest, most amazing. It's one of those things where you go, it's almost impossible as a writer to come up with something as cool as that. It just has to be something that was actually done. And it's so sad as well. And I love this bit and the fact that we can do it because it feels really real because it references a real thing. And I know there's something really special about that, but it was always one of those bits in the game that I thought, we've got to be able to represent this somehow. We have to be able to get these things in here.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that was actually based historically in real life, but that's really cool. Because I mean, my thing about the White Lines is that it was this completely surreal thing, but also it was kind of, it just added to the landscape. It's like, whoa, what the hell is that?
โดยรวมมันไปคุยเล่นกันมากกว่า
Something that I wanted to bring through in the art of the game was the same kind of fidelity that you find in both Jessica's music and Dan's writing, in the same kind of way that you have all of these little details, these very close attentions to detail that kind of really bring richness to the story. And something that was missing in the original mod version was just this lack of a visual layer of story. And something that I did throughout the art of the game is to add in all these little details here and there, little bits of story, little links to certain things that you may or may not hear or see.
ดูไกลๆแล้วอ่ะผมนึกว่า
Just a layer of richness in the world and give you some kind of reward for exploring.
นั้นเป็น
So
แข
keep
น
your eye out as you look around.
น่าซูมให้ดูน่ะมันเหมือนอยู่นะ เดี๋ยวผมเปิด cross hair กันวิดีโอเปิด cross hair นี่ไอเนี่ยเป็นหัวไอตรงเนี้ยคือโล่ที่ยกมาตั้งการ์ดทีเนี้ยไอเนี่ยเป็นแขนเว้ยแล้วตรงเนี้ยเป็นลำตัวไอนี่ก็คือขาที่กางออกมาไอเหี้ยกูนึกว่าตัวละครจากดาร์กโซไอ้เหี้ยโคตรเหมือนเลยโอเค
There's a scene in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about Celador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and about it's the sound of the words together. And Dear Esther actually comes from the introduction to From a Faith No More song, the Crab song on the first album, Introduce Yourself. And there's a point where I think it's Chuck at that point as the vocalist before Mike Patton just says Dear Esther, and it really lodged with me because the sound Dear Esther just has a really amazing sound to it. And I think when we started making it, and the idea of it being this series of letters to someone came through, it just came straight back out of going, that's just a really beautiful sounding combination of words. And I think that really sums up the whole approach to the writing in Dear Esther of what's the most beautiful combination of words and images we can put together, and to do it that way rather than writing a traditional plot as such. So yeah, Dear Esther, Faith No More and Doom, that's where it comes from.
เมื่อไหร่พวกมึงจะหยุดขิงเกมตัวเองสักทีวะเนี่ย
I think the central question to the entire experience for most people that have played it or are talking about it is this idea of, is the island real? Is what's going on a literal event of a man walking across a Scottish island, or is it a dream that he's had does the island even exist? And one of the things that we try to do with the writing is to constantly lull the player into a position where they got an understanding, they made a decision about what they thought was going on, and then to undercut it. So you never actually were able to settle on any one interpretation. And that was the challenge I set myself when I wrote the original mod, was can we put a story in a game that not only lends itself to multiple interpretations, but there is no stable interpretation. Every single interpretation you have will always have questions, and you'll never be able to fully trust what you think you understand about the game. So it's challenging, I think, for that result.
อะไรวะเนี่ย
It becomes quite a challenging kind of game story because of that, because you don't ever get that situation to go, I understand it now, I can walk away from this thing and it's all closed off and it's tidy. It was a very deliberate attempt to say, no matter where you think you are with this story, you're always questioning whether or not that's right.
โดยรวมผมก็ขี้เกียจฟังมันพูดแล้วนะคือสิ่งที่ผมได้รับรู้จากการนั่งฟังมันพูดเนี่ยหลักๆก็จะมีแค่การขิงเกมตัวเองนะอันนี้ก็จะเป็นรูปเส้นประสาทนะฮะส่วนนี้มันเป็นรูปเดียวกันกับที่อยู่ในบ้านผมคิดว่ามันอาจจะเป็นเบาะแสอะไรสักอย่างเพราะสัญลักษณ์พวกนี้มันตรงกันอ่ะภาพเนี้ยมันตรงกับอีกรูปหนึ่งส่วนอันนี้น่าจะเป็นรูปของไฮดราทีเนี้ยอันนี้อาจจะเป็นพวกเซลล์กล้ามเนื้อแทนแล้วอันนี้ล่ะนั่นสิอะไรก็ไม่รู้ว่าเกมอินดี้จัดทีนี้เราเดินลงน้ำได้ปะวะเราจะตายไหมเนี่ยไปอาบน้ำเล่นก่อนขาตัวเองก็มองไม่เห็นว่ายน้ำได้ไหมว่ายน้ำได้ด้วยวะเดี๋ยวจะเชื่อเดี๋ยวอย่าเพิ่งจมน้ำขึ้นไปก่อนอ้าวเฮ้ยเดี๋ยวข้างบนอยู่ไหนอะเงย
Come back.
กลับมาอ้าวเดี๋ยวความสำเร็จอะไรมึงบอกกูก่อนอ๋อจมน้ำ1 ครั้งกูแค่จมน้ำนี่ถือเป็นความสำเร็จได้ด้วยเหรอวะอย่าไปจมน้ำในชีวิตจริงนะมันเดือดร้อนคนอื่นคือเขาต้องไปช่วยเราอะไรอีกเลยสมมติว่าเราตายเขาก็ต้องมานั่งเก็บศพเราอีกนะเพราะงั้นเลิกคิดที่จะฆ่าตัวตายได้เลยนะฮะการโดดน้ำตายมันทำให้คนอื่นเดือดร้อน
One of the things that's been most commented on with the audio and the music in
กูรู้ว่ามึงจะขิง
Esther
เพลง
is
ตัวเอง
how
ใช่มันมี
sparse
มิว
it
สิก
is. And that was a really deliberate tactic. I wanted to leave room for the player to think and to dream and to wonder and to put their own interpretation into what was happening. And I think the problem with so much modern media is how bombarded we are constantly. It's the kind of MTV, flash in your face, constant music. And Dan and I watch a lot of drama together, and there really is constant
Endless,
music.
which is constantly telling you what you should feel, like really clearly, and it's like being kind of beaten up by the music sometimes.
And when you read a lot of reviews of Dear Esther, a lot of people say they had this time to think and to interpret, and that was one of their favourite things, that they placed themselves so directly into the game, and it's their experience. And I think that's actually the greatest success of the game on all points, from the story to Rob's art to the music, is we all left space for the player to dream.
คิดเพลงตัวเองแล้วเหมือนเขาจะบอกอะไรเกี่ยวกับว่า การเล่นเกมเนี่ยมันทำให้มีความรู้สึกเหมือนได้กลับมานั่งคิดถึงอะไรบางอย่าง
So there's a lot of places in the game where you see a lot of strange things, and this is very deliberate. One of the things we wanted to do is just kind of like not spoon feed the player every little piece of story. We kind of just some things are literally just in there to just kind of let you think and let you decide on whatever you want to bring to the story yourself. So it's kind of like I approached it like an impressionist painting where you've got like this kind of very vague outline of things, but if you stare at it enough, you can kind of like fill in the spaces, and kind of the image comes together on its own. So a lot of these kind of strange pieces of geography and stuff that's really kind of deliberate in some ways, just to kind of keep the player's mind open and kind of bring their own interpretations of the story through that.
เหมือนจะบอกว่าก็เกมนี้มันจะให้คุณได้ช่วยแบบได้มีความคิดที่แบบตัดสินใจว่าคุณจะไปเดินในเรื่องต่อหรืออะไรยังไงก็ไม่รู้แม่งให้กูมาทำอะไรในเกมนี้วะเนี่ยคือผมเปิดเกมนี้มาเพราะผมเห็นว่ามันเป็นเกมที่แบบดูแปลกๆดีมันดูแปลกตามันแบบลองเล่นดูดีไหมวะแต่ผมก็โดนหักหลังด้วยการ no subtitle แม่งเลยจบเลยพอแม่งไม่มีซับไตเติลกูปกติกูก็ฟังไม่ค่อยจะรู้เรื่องอยู่แล้วเฮ้ยลงได้ป่าวะโดนอ้าวดอลลี่ถ้าเดินกลับได้ไหมเนี่ยเหมือนจะกลับไม่ได้แล้วนะเมื่อตะกี้ก็มีปลดล็อก achievement ก็คือไม่ใช่นี้ช่างหัวแม่ง
When I was originally thinking about how to write the music for the game, I suddenly realised that you don't see it in the game.
อะไรพวกมึงจะเลิกพูดเกี่ยวกับเก
The most
ม
important character
พวกมึง
as
จะเอาเนื้อ
such
เรื่องไป
is the
กู
island itself. So one of the things that I did
รู้
with
ไหม
the
ว่า
music
มันใหญ่
was
เรื่อง
to
เกมพวก
write
มึงมาสักพัก
the
แล้วนะ
island as if she or he were a
ไม่
character
ยอมไป
in its
กู
own right. And that's really important, I think, that you're
ช่างแม่ง
All right, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. We're gonna address the elephant in the room, the very, very slow-moving elephant in the room. So this might be a longer conversation because it kind of fits with that. So Esther was the first of the what are now called walking simulators, and it was really interesting that for us it didn't feel that weird to have a game that was slower than normal, where actually there was lots of time to just walk around and think and look at things, and it was amazing at the time how this was seen as completely revolutionary, and it's really interesting, and it's amazing to see how many other games have kind of like taken it on board. For me, it came from, I didn't see it as being odd to have a game where very little happened, where you thought about what you were doing. The radio mast in Dear Esther was obviously there as a really important kind of design feature, as well as its place within the story. And that, I think, came from, it was really interesting, it being a Half-Life mod to begin with, and the Citadel in Half-Life 2, that it tells you how far you are through the game. You're always looking up to the skyline, am I closer to the Citadel, can I see it? And it lets you know how near you are to the end of the game. And it was really important because Esther's so open in a way, and because there isn't this, you're not using kind of shootouts or kind of gating it with combat encounters to kind of constantly keep you moving. That it was really, really important that you always had that focal point of going, I know exactly from the beginning of the game, virtually right from the start, you know where you're going, you know where the game's going to end up, and you know that sooner or later you're going to be either at the base of that thing or climbing that thing, and it's always there, that red light. And I think particularly with the colour palette of the game, the fact that you've got this very, very, very clear red light that's unlike any of the other colours in the game immediately tells you as a player, this is what the shape of this thing is going to be, this is where I'm going, this gives me a purpose, even if the sort of moment by moment is a bit more abstract.
Yeah, and navigationally as well, it helps you. It draws you in the right direction as you play the game. You can never get lost if you just follow that one landmark.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting place of where that sort of traditional game design is still, there's loads of it in Esther, it's just not necessarily done in quite the same way.
เมื่อกี้ที่เรือเนี่ยเขียนไว้ว่า and later did he eat or nor drink เหมือนว่าไม่จำเป็นเลยที่เขาจะต้องกินหรือดื่มซึ่งหมายความว่ายังไงกันนะผมคิดว่าผมน่าจะโฟกัสแค่เฉพาะตรงที่มันเป็นตัวอักษรหรือเป็นรูปที่มันมีไฮไลท์สีฟ้าจะดีกว่า
So something you'll notice as you look around the environment is, from a distance you see the landscape. It's kind of a beautiful place in some ways.
ที่นี่มันสวยตรงไหนวะเนี่ยมึงเจอซาก
Something
เรือ
I wanted to bring to the game was that
จริงๆมันก็แอบสวย
there's
อยู่
a
นิดนึง
second layer beneath the surface. Whereas if you look at things closely, you see that the actual island itself is very polluted. It's kind of very rotten. Everywhere you look, every rock, every grass surface, it has this layer of filth on it, and it's kind of been put in there just to kind of emphasize further that this island's a really unpleasant place to live. It's like if you scratch the surface, you see like just how corrupt this island is.
ตรงนี้มีรูปอะไรด้วยเหมือนกับตรงไปเหรอใช่เหรอไม่มีวิธีการทำอินเทอร์แลกกับสิ่งรอบตัวเลยเว้ยแต่เหมือนว่าอันเนี้ยน่าจะเป็นสัญลักษณ์ของอะไรบางอย่างซึ่งถ่ายเก็บไว้ก่อนแล้วกันคิดว่าน่าจะเป็นหนึ่งในเบาะแสหรือว่าไอ้สามไอ้ที่อยู่ด้านข้างของเส้นตรงเมื่อกี้จะเป็นภูเขากันนะก็รู้ว่าเกมนี้ไม่มีมอนกูระแว
We
งแล้วว่า
cast and did all the voice direction for Esther ourselves for the mod, and it was basically Jess and I on a casting website just listening to people's show reels and finding what's the voice of this thing, and there was never any question about Nigel. I think we heard his show reel for the first time round. It's probably been listened to sort of 30 or 40 actors, and we started listening to his show reel and just both looked at each other and went, that's it, that's him. And it was amazing when Nigel came in. We had, I think, a day and a half to do the whole thing. And he just did that amazing thing that really, really great actors did. If he just walked in, got in front of the microphone, and more or less did the entire thing in one take. And we did hardly any retakes on anything. It just felt like his instinct for the character in the game was so strong that he just, without virtually any direction, just came in and just got it. And one of the hardest things with the voiceover that we did was when we went from the mod, which had 3 potential narrative units per queue, to 4 potential narrative units per queue, was not only finding new bits of writing that kind of complemented and played off.
ช่างมันขี้เกียจฟัง
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game. Because, in some ways, it kind of like, I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole? Like we have no real death in the game. And from a design point of view, Dan, I mean, I don't know what you
it was really hard because it was a game where we couldn't let the player die. We didn't want to have respawns, but we had to handle the fact that there would be both accidents where the player would fall off a cliff or something, but also the deliberate urges of the player. Yeah. The first thing you're going to do is go, great, there's an ocean, how far out can I go? Or there's a cliff that's really high, can I jump off it? And how do you have death in a game where you can't have the player die? Because if the player starts breaking up the experience by dying and reloading, then you're in you start breaking the experience a lot. So yeah, I mean, we didn't want to also have like artificial boundaries, where it's like an invisible wall
Like if you take a look through the game, you'll never see a place where you think you can get to but you can't. There's always some kind of actual natural boundary or man-made boundary. So yeah, that was the other thing. We didn't really want to create this invisible wall around this thing. So
it kind of the whole drove the way in which that sort of the very weird audio visual, probably one of the most dreamlike bits in the game, where if you do die and you get the kind of the heartbeat and the strange flashes of visuals. And I think in a lot of ways, if we hadn't had the hole there and we hadn't had a place where we go, right, players will jump in this hole. We have to start from that basis. They will throw themselves down this hole. It kind of gave us the impetus to really focus on it. And I think the stuff like the drowning deaths and the cliff deaths are strong because the hole was there. And I'm not sure if the hole hadn't been there, whether or not we'd have arrived at that way of handling it, which I'm really proud of. I think it's a really incredibly creative, interesting way of handling a player going out of bounds and of actually being able to reset the game when the player's basically done something you ideally wouldn't want them to do.
Yeah, and I kind of think it fits well with the theme of the game as well, because you don't really know what's just happened.
Yeah,
it's not like you hear a death sound and then you kind of respawn. It's this kind of like very soft, very ambiguous change. You know?
There was a point in the original mod where if you died, it would do the whole Half-Life major fracture detected.
Yeah.
It always brought a really good tone to the game.
Yeah.
โอเคโอ้ยผมว่าผมควรจะสั่งข้าวเช้ามากินนะเนี่ยเอ๊ะหรือว่าจริงๆกูแค่ปวดขี้กูไม่ได้ปวดท้องหิวแต่กูปวดท้องขี้ปะโอเคจ้ะเมื่อตะกี้นะฮะไม่รู้มันพูดอะไรขี้เกียจฟังคือกูก็ตอบแชทที่ทำงานอยู่คือไม่ใช่ว่าวันนี้ไม่ใช่วันหยุดนะวันนี้กูจะหลอนทำไม
One of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states. And up until this point in the game, the music has been very sparse, very intimate, and very isolating in a way. But the island is also a beautiful and magnificent place, and what I wanted to do at this point for the first time in the game is to create something that was really epic. So we go from that shift in scale where it's very intimate and small to suddenly realising that this is an extraordinary and magical place to be, as well as a difficult and quite sad and melancholic place to be. So the string players were instructed at this point to play with much more vibrato. Up until this point, they've played in a very sort of Scottish style, actually.
มีบ้านอยู่บนยอดตรงนู้นนะเราก็เดี๋ยวลองไปเดินดูก่อนแล้วกันเนาะ
But this was a really beautiful cue to write.
ไม่งั้นเนี่ย
it has that scale.
พอไปถึงบ้านแล้วผมว่าจะปิดเกมนี้เลยเพราะว่ากูไม่รู้เรื่อง
you know, you have this beautiful vista. And the music then shifts.
เกมมันก็อินดี้ไปไหน
So the player can actually, just for a moment, I think, enjoy being where they are.
Yeah, I think that's it. Can I? Yeah, I was going to say, this is actually one of my favourite parts of the game. It's just where everything, all the elements kind of come together perfectly. You've got the music, which is just epic. As
Oh,
Jesse said, you've got the landscape, which is kind of like this big open space. You've got all the little bits and pieces that I put into the detail of the environment, like the movement, the leaves blowing around, in the sky. There's the mist rising off of the grass, and then you've got Dan's voiceover coming in there. It's just like all of these elements coming together and just in perfect synergy, and just kind of, it really brings you know, chills up your spine.
และนี่ก็คือในบ้านนะฮะเฮียไฮด้ากับในบ้านโคตรล้ำ
Inside the bothy there is a randomized chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and
เหมื
I
อน
think
รูปเวลา
it's
ตรวจช่องคัน
the
นะ
one instance of randomization in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally about how you understand the story.
รูปอะไร
I'm not
มอ
saying
ง
you
ไม่ชัด
don't care as much if you don't find it, but it just adds this other layer of just the ground falls away from him the first time I saw it, and the meaning of the crash in Esther's death just means so much more when you go, it's not just about her, there was an unborn child here. And I think that's where the randomization just hits its absolute peak, because it's one tiny detail that may or may not be there. But if it's there, it's going to fundamentally change the way you feel about the entire thing. And that's the strength that the randomization elements in Esther kind of provide, that you go, your likely kind of feeling about the story and your understanding about the story can be changed so absolutely by the occurrence or not of one tiny little prop detail. And that's something which...
พอไม่ฟัง
So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting, because when we made it, we kind of had to, you know, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type thing. But when it came out, people started coming back and saying, this game is absolutely terrifying. I was really, really frightened. And that was really amazing. And I think it's because nothing happens. We're so trained in games to go, there's stimulus all the time, that if nothing happens, you're waiting for something to happen. And kind of, I tend to go back to again and again the whole sequence in Dead Space 2 when you go back to the Ishimura, and it's like the best bit of Dead Space 2, because for what feels like hours, but it's probably only about 15 minutes, nothing happens and no necromorph comes at you, and it's...
So one of the things that influenced the visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time, and also the kind of themes of the game. Like, tech-wise, we were never ever gonna kind of achieve photorealism, and I think that was a good thing. I mean, really, it made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively.
We should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about Stalker kind of thing going on here. But when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with Stalker. And I think that was one of the major things behind it in terms of when people talk about game inspirations. I mean, for me, there's a lot of FPS stuff in there, Doom, System Shock, but I think Stalker probably more than anything else. And Roadside Picnic, the Strugatsky novel that Stalker's based on, of the idea of this incredible space that you didn't understand, that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about. And for
one of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player.
กูจะไม่ฟังเรื่องพวกมึงแล้วโอเคเอาเป็นว่าเรามาชมทิวทัศน์ของเกมนี้กันนะก็โอ้โหมีชายหาดหรือเปล่าเป็นเนินหินเป็นโขดหินนะที่ก็ดูสวยงามนะแล้วก็ข้างบนมันเป็นโอ้โหทิวเขา
So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel certain things. With this shipwreck on the beach, you can kind of, like, if you look at it from certain angles, you get this real like it's like a cross sticking up. It's this kind of semi-religious imagery, but it really kind of it's not obvious. It's not in your face. It's just kind of like something that makes you feel like something you know, and so like there's a lot of deliberate attempts in the game to
ที่นี่ไม่ควรจะมีคนติดที่นี่เป็นดินแดนรกร้างไม่ใช่เหรอ
It's kind of hard to point out in many other places, but it's done in a way where every single rock, every single plant, every single cliff face has been deliberately placed and designed in a way to try and make you feel something in the game.
สรุปตายนะอ้าวไม่ตายเหรอเจคอบสันทำเรื่อง The Boy เสร็จแล้วเหมือนเราจะตกลงมาในหลุมนะฮะก็คือกูเดินลงมาในหลุมเองแหละกูนึกว่าจะเป็นทางเดินไปดีๆ แล้วมึงมานอนแอ้งแม่งอยู่ตรงเนี้ยเมื่อไหร่มึงจะลุกนั่นแหละสุดยอดมึงยังไม่ตายอีกเหรอหัวมึงยังไม่กูนึกว่าศัตรูหัวมึงยังไม่แตกอีกเหรอเนี่ยดูดิหาฟังอะไรไปเรื่อย
The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's we kind of use the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and it's to me has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to.
This for me is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing. It has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song. And with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it. And it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point where the environment art and the music just meld so beautifully and so seamlessly into one. I mean, on a personal level, I've played the game hundreds of times now, and I still enter the caves and I look at Rob's work and I'm just absolutely overawed, just gobsmacked by its beauty. And I just think it's a really magical moment in gaming for me, actually. I know that probably sounds really dramatic, but I just think it absolutely hits something where everything just works together. And the music is so dreamlike. You know, Rob has talked about the journey through the body, and I think that's absolutely, for me, the music becomes so organic and fluid and actually very feminine and female at that point. You're hearing the voice of his love.
มีวงจรเต็มเลยฮะอันนี้มีวงจรนะอันนี้เป็นตัวเฟดนะฮะซึ่งใครที่เรียนวงจรไฟฟ้าวงจรอิเล็กทรอนิกส์จากทางมหาลัยจะรู้นะฮะถ้าใครที่อยากจะรู้เรื่องว่านี่มันเป็นตัวอะไรนี่คือเฟดนะฮะมีขายอยู่ในเว็บอยู่อันนี้จะเป็นกราวนะอันนี้เป็นค่าความต้านทานนะแล้วก็นี่อะไรหม้อแปลงเหรอดูเป็นไปไม่ได้อันนี้เป็นตัว C นะฮะนี่ก็ตัว C ตัว C ตัว C นี่เป็นวงจรอะไรกันแน่นะผมคิดว่าทุกอย่างมันต้องนี่หม้อแปลงเดี๋ยวนะสรุปแล้วไอ้รูปที่อยู่ตรงโคนเห็นนั่นคือหม้อแปลงเหรอคือหนึ่งในวงจรไฟฟ้างั้นเหรอเนี่ยบ้าจ้ะไม่อยากเชื่ออ้าวมึงอย่าบอกนะว่าหมดแล้วอ่ะกูเดินสำรวจหมดแล้วเนี่ย สรุปหมดแล้วอ๋ออินดี้เกินมึงจะไอ้สัสเดี๋ยวนะสรุปกูมาจากทางไหนวะคิดว่าผมมาจากทางด้านล่างนะเพราะว่าตอนที่เดินมาเหนือทางมันยกระดับสูงขึ้นเองมาถูกทางแล้วทำไมใจกูเต้นแปลกๆวะตื่นเต้นเว้ย
I just want to say that I think
ต้องไปอีกแล้วเหรอไปก็ได้อะ
caves in games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look from it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those. I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. And you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things that if a player does this, then this. And we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer, as a creative, is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head and that the system can be whatever you want it to be. But if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge number of them in the way that there might be with a very mechanically complex game. So you can really heavily focus on what is the game experience that's being played out within the player's sort of mind and heart at the moment. And there are other, sort of, I know this is a kind of a way of approaching game design that has become increasingly popular over the last few years, and like Journey was a really, really good example of that game company really focusing on what's the emotional experience of playing this game. But I think, again, it's probably one of the reasons why Esther has lasted as long as it has done, because it's not a mechanical exercise, it's an exercise in trying to inspire you as a player to have the deepest experience and the deepest engagement and to really run the game in your own head rather than being something that you're sitting 6 feet away from kind of interacting with. I hate interaction as a term for that. I think it becomes very cold and mechanical and systems driven, and really interaction is completely trivial and pointless if there isn't an emotional engagement with the player and you haven't. What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, and if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was championed by Half-Life 2.
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little first...
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you know at this point in the game is kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island, and the idea that this kind in a lot of ways the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult because then you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there, and each one of those had to have an absolute clarity and to really kind of work. So I think for me, it was really interesting. It's like the difference between writing kind of fiction and writing poetry. When you read really amazing poets and you have that.
The sound
ผม
here
คิด
is
ว่าไป
a
ทางซ้าย
classic
น่าจะเป็น
case of
ทาง
again
ออก
what
แล้วนะ
music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful,
เราลองไปดูหน่อยก็ได้
epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind, and it's a classic case of foreshadowing. So we know from this point that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult, and yeah, it's something that music does really well, I think, which is that emotional signalling and signposting.
Damascus Asfaken Riho Damascus เหรอ Oh my god นี่มันอะไรเนี่ย
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the
พันธะ
caves where everything was written. And it moves to the back end of the level, and you have this long corridor that's
ที่
full
นี่
of this
กำลัง
kind of
หาวิธีสร้างมนุษย์ขึ้นมาเหรอ
it's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory and you know.
ตอนแรกกูก็จะแคปรูปไว้ให้หมดอะแต่ว่า
this really
ไม่ไหว
frenetic moment.
Away from being a city.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath the mountain, and you feel the weight of that mountain, and just the. I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on, and it really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness of going. You would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this, and I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols is a lot more broken down as well. Like you see some symbols before like scattered around the environments, but at this point they're like right in your face, and they're kind of it's just total madness, you know. Any kind of meanings have been crossed over and confused, and you know, I think it really helps to bring the tension up. At this point in the level as well, so you're kind of coming out of this dreamlike state a little bit.
Yeah, you kind of know that you're getting towards the end of the serenity into something that's a bit more disturbed than that. Yeah.
โอ้โหมีให้กูดำน้ำซะด้วยกูก็ดันรู้เรื่องอะเนี่ยเพราะว่าหาทางไปต่อไม่เจออันต้าซาวอีกแล้วเหรอเมื่อไหร่กูจะได้ออกจากถ้ำวะเนี่ย What the fuck?
The motorway scene, the biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a completely new thing.
Yeah, it's well, I wasn't sure where the idea spawned from.
So the admission really is
เหมือนเมื่อกี้มันจะแสดงให้เห็น
play
ว่า
fast
มันไปเอาไอเดียแบบนี้มา
and
จากไหนอยู่
the
นี่นะ
M5. There isn't actually a welcome break service. It's just
ถ้าโดยรวมแล้วไม่ค่อยมีเนื้อเรื่องเดินเท่าไหร่จะเป็นการคุยเล่นระหว่าง
What a thing as a
ทีมงานมากกว่า
something that's based vaguely on someone in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I really love about, what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, you know, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on. Gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the surrealness of the caves. Actually, you're kind of going, this is really surreal. This is really dreamlike, but actually, I'm talking about, you know, a car accident just outside a little chef, and it kind of that playing off those two things against each other.
It's like making the ordinary extraordinary.
Absolutely, yeah.
คือทุกคนเหมือนมันจะไม่มีทางไปต่อแล้วอะโอเคผมคิดว่าเกมนี้อาจจะจบลงแค่นี้อินดี้ไปเปล่าวะต้องลองขึ้นเนินไปดูก่อนนะเพราะผมคิดว่าบางทีเราอาจจะขึ้นเนินได้ไม่มีควันอยู่ตรงนั้นวะนะ What เกิดอะไรขึ้นทำไมอยู่ควันกูอยู่ใต้น้ำไม่ใช่เหรอมันมีควันวะผมเดินขึ้นมาข้างบนนะแล้วก็เห็นรั้วแล้วก็จอดับกูคิดไปเองกูไม่น่าไปคิดว่าเกมมันจบแล้วเลย
This scene to me is like really,
ทางออกหรือเปล่านะ
really iconic because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together. It's really kind of like a symbol of rebirth, and it actually brings together a lot of the visual goals that I wanted to achieve with a lot of the symbolism in the game. Like I've talked a little bit about how the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this. And the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Yeah.
Because we've gone
Well,
to
yeah, but
sings
you're
always throughout, you know, we've got always, and then she sings never, and a moment of absolute soaring. It's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells and you just kind of, it is like a moment of change has happened in some way, and
it's rebirth, isn't it? For me, it's his moment of clarity and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you're literally moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel. You're actually doing that as you go through.
But the music, especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like that kind of just totally made it.
ก็อ้าวกูนึกว่าจบแล้วยังเหรอยังอีกเหรออ๋อคือเดินมาทางนี้ไปถึงที่นี่เหมือนเดินมาตั้งนานแล้วกลับมาที่นอกถ้ำที่เดิมปะ
on lots of projects together, non-game projects before we made Dear Esther.
ไม่น่าใช่
And I think the thing that links all of the projects that we've worked on together is the idea of hidden stories and layers of stories. And one of the things I wanted to do with the music was to embed hidden little hints and stories into it. So the music that you hear here
เพลงอีกแล้วเหรอ
has Morse code.
มึงไม่มีอย่างอื่นจะพูดแล้วใช่ไหม
And the Morse code is spelling out the word Esther. And I really liked this concept of that some people would understand that it was Morse code and try and figure out what it was saying. It also provided a really interesting rhythmical dynamic. And yeah, it's just about these ideas of hidden stories and layers, but it also starts to emphasize the obsessional nature, I think, of the story in Dear Esther, and his agitation and actually slight panic. So you're getting this rhythm that just repeats and repeats and repeats obsessively. So I think even if you don't understand that it's saying Esther, and even if you don't understand that it's Morse code, you're still getting this feeling of this obsessional repetition and slight panic that he has. And again, it's kind of it's the new chapter, and it's spelling out that something has changed at this point.
พอเห็นรูปแบบประมาณนี้แล้วผมคิดว่าจริงๆแล้วร่างกายมนุษย์เราอาจจะเป็นพวกพันธะทางเคมีนี่แหละพันธะทางเคมีมาประกอบรวมกันกลายเป็นร่างกายของเราซึ่งก็ไม่ได้มีโอกาสเป็นไปไม่ได้มีโอกาสเป็นไปได้อยู่ถ้าเผลอมันอาจจะเป็นเรื่องจริงอยู่แล้วตั้งแต่แรกก็ได้
What's fascinating to me, Dan, is that you're an atheist, but each of the 3 games that we've made are so strongly about religion, either the language or taking allegories and stories. Why are you so drawn to it?
I think I'm really interested in people.
All right,
and
from heaven,
the stories that make up people, and I think there is like in the Bible,
around
most kind of religious texts. It's not about what it is, it's about what is behind what it is, and that's what you're really getting to, is the idea of the sort of the parable or the metaphor. And it really felt like, particularly with Paul on the road to Damascus, is a story that many people know and we can understand, and it's about redemption and consequence and guilt and transformation and who you really are and what that means. And it felt like just a really strong, powerful way of making it very accessible, the narrator's kind of inner turmoil in a kind of a story that we know really well. And there's a universality to those kind of questions that, whether it's, Christianity, whether it's Islam, whether it's kind of Buddhism, that they're asking very broadly similar questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a good person? How should we behave to each other? How should we feel about the world we're in? And it's a really powerful way of speaking to a lot of people. And I think that's always been really important as well, is that it's about saying no matter who you are or what your kind of like outlook on life is, whether that's faith-based or secular, that we are all effectively asking the same questions. And that's why I think all our games kind of tend to be around those questions.
On a sudden, a light from heaven shone around him. น่าจะเป็นโชนที่มาจากชายชายที่แปลว่าส่องแสงก็แสดงว่าเมื่อกี้มันไม่ใช่ all right กูเพิ่งอ่าน all right ที่ยังไงวะทันใดนั้นก็มีแสงจากสวรรค์ส่องลงมาที่รอบตัวของเขาและเขาก็ได้ร่วงหล่นลงสู่พื้นนี่มันอิคารัสเหรออิคารอสเหรอเหมือนเรื่องราวของอิคารอสที่บินไปหาแสงทันใดนั้นแสงก็ได้ฉายแสงลงมาบนตัวของเขาซึ่งจริงๆแสงมันฉายอยู่แล้วพอแสงมันได้ฉายลงมาบนตัวของเขาทำให้เขาปีกละลายหลังจากนั้นอิคารอสก็ได้ร่วงหล่นสู่พื้นดินเป็นไปได้อยู่
So Dear Esther is the first walking simulator. How do you feel about walking simulator?
Walk simulator.
I think I took offence to it when it first became a thing, but I think actually I don't mind it so much now. I think the fact that we have kind of taken ownership over it, like that genre has been kind of made our own by not just our game, but like a bunch of different games have kind of embraced it. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I'm still really confused about the need to categorise in games, probably more than any other creative.
There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because they're so simple. Everything is exposed, and everything has to be exceptionally
คน
good
เหรอ
for
น่ะ
it to work
ใช่ไหม
because you are
หรือว่าหินอีกแล้ว
you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal.
ข้างหน้าก็เป็นบ
One
อล
of the
ไฟ
things that I think
มึง
was
จะติด
added
ดักโซเกินไปหน่อยปะ
more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game. These are not like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose
ในเกมนี้มันเราอยู่ใน
silhouettes
เกาะรก
that
ร้าง
you'll
อ่ะผม
see
คิดว่าเราไม่น่าจะ
around
เจ
the
อคน
island,
นะ
usually like quite a distance off or just kind of somewhere that you'd barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good
And
example of where
as
it's kind
he
of
was-
really in your face. And these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some
Proceeding.
unreal
อะไรอ่ะ
elements to the island, but something supernatural as well, something that's kind of
Proceeding.
beyond
on
this
his
world,
journey
something kind of unsettling.
proceed เหรอ
And yeah, a lot of effort's been put in to make these things very subtle. Didn't really want them to be like, I didn't want it to be a ghost story, so to speak, but I just kind of wanted to bring some of this supernatural element into the game, and this area is probably one of the most prominent because you can see
The overlook, the point about this to me is that it's probably the voiceover in the game that kind of sums up the whole story and the experience. It's almost like a recap of everything that's gone before you start the final climb. And you know it's that pause before you're going to start the final climb and before the game's kind of builds to a climax. But you can also see the whole level, and it's like the idea that you are standing looking down on your own journey, a bit like the idea of your life flashing before your eyes, or sort of like seeing your body but having an out-of-body experience at the moment of death. And it was really designed to try and get that feeling as the player that you stop and you take stock of everything, and there's a bit of a sense of there's no going back. You take a breath, and now it finishes. And I really wanted to kind of achieve that sort of sense, and I think we did. I think it really came together here. You got that sense of going,
and was
right,
come
now this
yeah,
ends,
to
and now I
Damascus.
move forwards to it.
มีสองข้างเลยนะ and he was
so here
there
it kind of
the
the environment becomes a little
with-
bit more surreal again. We kind of play with the colors a little bit, bring up the
without-
saturation. It's kind of a little bit of a return to some of the more
side
cave-like aesthetics in terms of colors and stuff like that.
อันนี้กัน and
And
neither
it's kind of there to kind of
and
signpost
did the
another
did the-
significant moment in the game, or something that's
Not
leading up to the
ไม่สำคัญ
significant
เลยว่า
moment. It goes
เราจะได้กิน
back to this
หรือ
kind of
ดื่มหรือ
idea
เปล่า
of having these emotional signposts in the visuals of the game, without it being overly obvious.
ตอน
And
นี้
some
บรร
of
ยากาศ
that
ผมเปลี่ยนเป็นสีม่วงซะแล้วอะ
emotional stuff comes through just through the
Really?
colors of the environment, and the more saturated they are, the more kind of surreal things become.
ใครจะมาทนเล่นเกมอินดี้
So
แบบ
this
กู
is
เนี่ย
kind of like a turning point in the game. It's kind of like the final notice of you reaching the end.
อะไรนะ you reaching the end เหรอเราใกล้ถึงจุดจบแล้วกันเหรอเนี่ย หรือว่าแค่จบด่านนี้เฉย
The music that's playing here is
มึงยังไม่อวด
a
มึงยังไม่
repeat of
อวด
another
เพลง
key,
เลย
and originally we hear it played
Ma'am.
on the piano, and the string quartet take on the piece here. And it's one of those really nice instances where we were in the studio and I had this idea of how it was going to sound, and I thought it was going to be quite full and rich and full-bodied, and then one of the string players said to me, this is wrong actually for what we're playing, and they said let's strip out all the vibrato, let's play it in a really Scottish plain style. And it absolutely transformed that piece, and it's one of the really special things about being a composer, is that you get to collaborate with people who come fresh to it. So you have this preconceived idea of how it should be, and then they say, no, why don't we turn it around and think about it like this? And it absolutely fits and works for that scene, because what we're getting at this point is a sense of fragility, of an ending, and it's almost reminiscent of a funeral procession. It's slow and it's dirge-like, but yeah, it was just a lovely moment where they gave something of themselves. And
it was possible that this last section of the game could have felt quite laborious and forced because it's two long zigzagging paths that just go up, and there was a real importance to getting it right. Quite a lot of work went into it. I think at this point for me, you probably as a player understand that the narrator's going to die at the end, and this is it. And unlike where the rest of the island, there's a sense of this could just keep going on forever and ever and ever, and you're going to keep the motif of come back. But I think when you set on this path, we really wanted to have that sense of this is it. This is the last time you're going to walk these paths.
With the climb being quite a poignant moment of the game overall and of the story, it was quite a difficult task to try and make that climb still interesting and not too laborious, because it's kind of this zigzag up there with nothing really. There's no real environment. You just kind of have the sea on one side and the cliff face on the other. So there was quite a lot of work that went into kind of building up this feeling of tension as you're rising and kind of making this moment as poignant as possible while still making it interesting. So a lot of effort was put into building up this weather, building up the wind, and the swaying of the grass, and kind of the volume of the soundscapes, and everything mixing together with the music, and just kind of visually really trying to make this a tense moment. And I think it's hopefully been pulled off all right. And you'll notice when you get to the top, this kind of tension dies, and that's very purposeful. You'll see no more wind. It's just kind of like a symbolic thing where you're coming to the last moment, the point of no return, and that's been very deliberately designed that way.
Damascus กูยังไม่เจอแมปหิมะแสดงว่าเกมมันยังไม่จบใช่ไหมข้างบนนี้มีพายุซึ่งถ้าได้พูดเนี่ยถ้าเรามองจากมุมบนผมก็ไม่เห็นว่ามันน่าจะมีแบบหิมะอยู่ตรงไหนเลยอ้าวอันนี้มันขยับเองอะ
We had a lot of debates, didn't we, about the ending of the game and whether the player should retain control or whether it was okay to go to a cutscene at this point. I personally don't mind it. I actually actively like it because I think it works really well as a metaphor for loss of control at that point. Dan, I know you're not as keen.
Yeah, I'm not. I would have loved the player not to have had control taken away from them, but to me it was a balance between two evils: the evil of having a cutscene and the evil of the player accidentally falling off the ladder halfway up and destroying the ending.
Yeah, I agree. Like I think we tried a few different things, and the tech at the time just wasn't, the ladder tech at the time just wasn't there. So
จะบอกนะมึงจะโดนพายุพัดไปอ่ะแล้วมึงก็ไปตก
and the other
ที่แม
thing
ป
for
หิ
me
มะ
was pacing. It was making sure all the music, the voiceovers, the timings and everything were perfect for that final jump off point, and just letting the players kind of noodle around going up a ladder for what may have been like 7 minutes because it's a tall tower was kind of an impossible task.
One of the things that I enjoyed the most on working on Dear Esther was Rob's beautiful visuals were so inspiring, but Dan's words are always so amazing to write to. I think that's where we start as a partnership. And the music at the end was so easy to write because that last voiceover, it's the pinnacle of the writing to me, as it should be, because it's the last VO, so you would have failed if it wasn't good, but it is just so beautiful and moving. And for me, talking about whether it's a hopeful ending, the music is really hopeful at this point.
ก็อย่าแปลกใจนะ
And
ตอนนี้
it
คือถามว่าทำไมมัน
signifies to me transformation,
เมื่อกี้มันโดดลงมาทำไมหัวตัวเอง
freedom,
ไม่แบะ
escape,
พื้นนะ ก็คือตอนเนี้ย
acceptance. Yeah, and it was just a beautiful
มัน
key
เป็น
to
นก
write, actually.
นะฮะ ก็คือเหมือน
I don't know, can't remember quite where it came from in the mod.
เหมือน
but
จ
the
ริงๆแล้วตั้ง
moment
แต่แรก
when
อะ
we went,
เราคือนกเว้ย
or we could put the bird in there, you could see the bird's shadow, and actually it turned from being kind of like a straightforward literal suicide
นกอะไรว่ายน้ำได้
into
วะ
a metaphorical, or to my mind, kind of like I always really believed the narrator
Yeah,
did
cool.
turn into a bird just before they hit the ground, and that was really important. I think it's probably the strongest ending in any of our games so far. But yeah, I'm very proud of the way everything came together in that last section.
Yeah, I think it's the bird thing is particularly interesting because I think it was in the original mod, but the timings and everything were just all off, and you never really saw the seagull. Yeah, at least the shadow as well. It was all kind of like a little bit broken. And I remember when we went back in, I made a real effort to try and get that shadow just out of the center of the view, so you kind of have this hint of something happening, and I think you can hear the sound of a seagull flapping its wings. It's like very subtle, but like I say, I kind of really like the way that came together. It kind of it's very like say it's kind of like a release, but at the same time there's still this kind of ambiguity there that's kind of beautiful.
And I'm really proud that I got the monitor in at the end for an ending of, it goes into the hospital monitor, signifying the flat line. And I think it's one of those moments where you never want to be so clever that people notice it and it takes them out of the moment, but it just flows
ทำไมพูดเหมือ
in
นจะร้อง
through
ไห้
the
เลยวะ
music, and it just feels like everything comes together at that last point. That last VO, Rob's amazing visuals and the music. And yeah, it feels like a really, really strong and beautiful ending.
And then in the last second, Nigel Carrington's delivery of just those two words have come back, where he just pitch perfect.
Yeah. So that's the end of the director's commentary. We'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you've uncovered some secrets and some facts that you didn't know about the game before.
We'd also like to say a huge thank you for buying the game, and for all our fans who've been behind us and been behind the game and have kept it alive all these years. It's a real privilege that it's still out there, still such a title that people love so much.
Yeah, and we're really looking forward to the future and what we can create coming up next.
หลัก
Thanks for
ๆเกม
listening.
ตอนนี้ก็เป็นช่วงขอบคุณนะ ก็คือขอบคุณกันแล้วก็ลากันเรียบร้อยแล้วนะ ก็จบกันไปแล้วนะกับเกม Dear Esther นะ ที่แม่งพูดทั้งเรื่องไม่เกี่ยวกันในเรื่องเลย มีเบาะแสอยู่มากมายแต่มันเป็นปริศนาทิ้งเอาไว้ ให้เราได้นั่งสงสัยนะ ก็จบลงไปแล้วนะกับเกม The Esther Landmark Edition นะก็ขอบคุณผู้ชมทุกท่านที่รับชมนะแหมที่ตอนแรกแม่งดนตรีอย่างดังเลยพอมาเอ็นเครดิตไม่มีดนตรีซะงั้นแหมอยากจะด่าโอเคไม่เป็นไรก็เขาก็ทำเกมมาได้ดีมีทิวทัศน์ที่สวยงามนะบรรยากาศในการเดินที่แบบเมื่อไหร่กูจะเดินจบ เมื่อไหร่กูจะเดินจบวะตรงนี้มันจบหรือยังวะเดินแล้วแบบเมื่อไหร่จะจบวะถามว่าถ้าตัดไอเสียงที่เขาพูดออกไปอ่ะก็คือคือก็เกมนี้มันก็ดูไม่มีสีสันอะไรเลยด้วยซ้ำที่เขาพูดอาจจะไม่ได้เกี่ยวกับเนื้อเรื่องอาจจะเป็นการพูดเกี่ยวกับความรู้สึกผมคิดว่ามันเป็นในเชิงความรู้สึกว่ามันอาจจะไม่ได้อวดเพลงตัวเองหรอกเหมือนอารมณ์ว่าเอาคนที่เล่นมาก่อน3คนที่แบบมานั่งเล่นด้วยกันพร้อมกันอะไรเงี้ยแล้วแบบเอามานั่งพิจารณาดูเฮ้ยมาถึงนี่แล้วแบบคุณรู้สึกยังไงวะไม่ใช่คนเล่นเกมหรอกเป็นผู้พัฒนาแหละผู้พัฒนา3คนมานั่งเล่นด้วยกันแล้วคือช่วยกันทำแล้วเล่นด้วยกันใช่ไหมแล้วก็ระหว่างที่เล่นด้วยกันแล้วตรงนี้อัดเสียงแล้วก็อธิบายว่ามันเกิดอะไรขึ้นตอนนี้มันเกิดอะไรขึ้น ก็อะไรก็ว่าไปนี่ลิขสิทธิ์นะ copyright 2020 the Chinese room all right reserved นะก็จบลงไปแล้วนะ แล้วก็ลองกด start ดูก็คือทั้งหมดนี้เป็นผมเล่นหมดแล้วนะฮะก็คือเราก็เดินไปพูดไปทั่วแล้วล่ะโอเคงั้นก็สำหรับวันนี้แหมเปิดเกมมาเล่นแต่เช้าเลยเล่นไปประมาณ1 ชั่วโมง 45 นาทีนะเกมก็ได้จบลงเป็นที่เรียบร้อยนะฮะก็ขอบคุณคุณผู้ชมทุกท่านที่มารับชมนะไม่ว่าจะจากอดีตอนาคตหรือว่าปัจจุบันนะฮะก็เชียร์แกนยังไงก็ฝากกดไลค์กดแชร์กด subscribe กดกระดิ่งกดติดตามกดพิมพ์คอมเมนต์นะฮะคือวิดีโอนี้ผมคงไม่ค่อยได้พูดจริงๆจังๆแหละเพราะว่ามันเกมมันอินดี้อ่ะกูก็แปลในเรื่องแม่งไม่ออกอีกเพื่อนพอจับใจความได้นิดนึงไอ้ผู้หญิงแม่งก็ขยันพูดเรื่องเพลงเหลือเกินพวกผู้ชายก็พูดเกี่ยวกับเรื่องบรรยากาศของเกมซะส่วนใหญ่คือก็ตรงตามแนวที่เขาได้แปะไว้นะว่าเป็นจำลองสถานการณ์การเดินนะตอนช่วงท้ายๆจะมีการพูดถึงคำว่าwalk simulation นะฮะส่วนอินดี้นี้คืออันเนี้ยน่าจะเป็นบรรยากาศที่คนเล่นแล้วรู้สึกได้เองนะฮะแม่งอินดี้จังวะมีบรรยากาศนะมีบรรยากาศก็คือบรรยากาศที่แบบต่างๆเป็นการบิวดนตรีมีเสียงทะเลมีโน่นมีนั่นมีนี่นะฮะก็คือกูเล่น2 ชั่วโมงจบแล้วคงไม่มีใครโอ้ยเหมือนดวงตาเลยคงไม่มีใครมาบอกว่ากูทำสถิติเคลียร์เกมนี้ได้เร็วที่สุดกูว่าคงไม่น่ามีเนาะเพราะพาคานี่เยอะขึ้นไปเพื่อที่จะกระโดดลงมาตายไม่ตายปีนขึ้นไปเฉยนะแล้วก็จบลงไปที่เรียบร้อยแล้วนะก็สำหรับวันนี้ก็ผมคามิยะโทสกินะฮะเดี๋ยวไปเปลี่ยนชื่อเป็นคามิยะสึเกมเมอร์แล้วกันนะโอเคไหมเดี๋ยวไปเปลี่ยนเป็นคามิยะสึเกมเมอร์ก็คามิยะเกมเมอร์ก็แบบDear Esther Landmark Edition นะก็ต้องขอตัวลาไปก่อนนะเดี๋ยวไว้เจอกันใหม่เกมหน้าครับตอนนี้ก็สวัสดีครับ See you again next game ครับผมมันไม่ออกจากจอนี้ผมอะออกไปเว้ย เดี๋ยวให้คนตัดต่อเขาไปตัดออก